My sister-in-law's mother looked across the candlelit table at me and smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "So, you work for the government?" she asked, tilting her champagne glass in my direction. "Something clerical?" Before I could open my mouth, my mother set down her fork with a soft, practiced clink and said, "She manages inventory. For the army. It's basically filing, but in a uniform." My brother, David, laughed from across the table. He was wearing a new watch I didn't recognize, something silver and heavy on his wrist. He'd been flashing it all evening. "She's never even left the country," he added, cutting into his steak like the conversation was already over. "4 years in, and she's still stateside, shuffling boxes." The table held 12 people. My soon-to-be sister-in-law, Renee, sat beside my brother, her expression carefully neutral. Her family occupied the far end her father, a quiet man named Gerald who ran a logistics company out of Atlanta, and her mother, who had been introduced to me 40 minutes earlier simply as Colonel Patricia Weston, retired. I had shaken her hand and felt the grip. Firm, deliberate, the kind of handshake you only develop after years of meaning it. She had looked at me, then really looked and said, "Supply chain?" "Yes, ma'am," I'd said. She'd nodded, just once, and smiled like she already knew something the rest of the table didn't. That was 40 minutes ago. Now she was watching my mother describe my career as filing in a uniform, and her expression had gone very, very still. "My name is Clara Mendez. I was 27 years old on the night of my brother's rehearsal dinner, and I had been a logistics officer in the United States Army for 4 years. I held the rank of first lieutenant, and there were things about those 4 years that I had never told my family, things I could not tell them. Things that were not mine to tell. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started. Not the dinner table, not the champagne and the candlelight and my mother's small, careless cruelty. Let me take you back to the house I grew up in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, where I first learned that some children are chosen and some children are tolerated, and the difference between the two has nothing to do with who they actually are. David was 3 years older than me, and from the time I can remember, he was the sun around which our family orbited. He was handsome in the easy way that people notice immediately, confident in the way that gets mistaken for competence, and our parents, my mother especially, had decided early that he was the one who mattered most. Not because he was cruel. He wasn't, not always, but because he was chosen, and I was not, and no one ever explained why, and I stopped asking around age 9. I was a good student. I ran cross-country. I volunteered at the VA hospital on Saturdays, starting at age 15 because my grandfather, Papa Hector, had been a Korea-era veteran with a bad knee and a beautiful laugh, and sitting with the old men in those hallways felt like sitting with him, even after he was gone. My parents considered this a quirk. My mother once told her friend on the phone, not knowing I was in the next room, that she didn't understand why Clara couldn't just join a normal club like David did. David was in student council, David won regional debate, David got a partial scholarship to Ohio State, and my parents threw a party with a balloon arch. When I told them I had been accepted to officer candidate school, my mother sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the refrigerator for a long moment. My father said, "Is that safe?" David said, "I mean, it's not exactly a corner office, but good for you, Clara." That was it. That was the send-off. My grandmother, Abuela Rosa, my father's mother, who had come from Guadalajara with $40 and a sewing kit and built something real and lasting with her hands, she was the one who drove me to the bus station. She pressed $300 into my palm and held my face in both her hands and said, "You are going to be extraordinary. Don't let them make you small." I thought about that every single day for the next 4 years. OCS was hard in the way that rearranges something inside you. The first weeks I cried in the shower because I didn't want anyone to see, and then I stopped crying altogether. Not because the hard parts stopped, but because I learned to carry them differently. I found out I was good at systems, at seeing how pieces fit together, at understanding the math of movement and supply and distribution that keeps an army functioning in the field. My instructors told me I had a gift for it. I started to believe them. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the spring, promoted to first lieutenant 18 months later, and assigned to a unit that I cannot name in a capacity that I am not at liberty to detail, other than to say that the work I did in that assignment was not, in any version of the word, filing. I will tell you this. There are operations that succeed because the right equipment reaches the right people at the right moment. There are missions that come home because someone, somewhere, built a supply chain under conditions that would make most people quit, in places that don't appear on public maps, during windows of time so narrow that a single miscalculation means the difference between a successful extraction and a flag folded over a coffin. I know what that feels like. I know what it costs. I came home from my last assignment thinner than I'd left and quieter in a way I couldn't fully explain. My mother said I looked tired. She said David had just been promoted to regional VP and they were thinking of getting him a car. I didn't go back home much after that. Which brings me to the rehearsal dinner. David had met Renee at a conference in Charlotte 18 months earlier. She was sharp and warm and laughed at herself easily, and I liked her almost immediately. Her family was from Virginia, old military family, the kind where service wasn't a talking point but a way of life. Her father, Gerald, had served briefly in the Navy before leaving to build his business. Her mother, Colonel Patricia Weston, had served for 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before retiring. I found this out from Renee directly, in a phone call 2 weeks before the wedding, when she called to tell me how much she was looking forward to meeting me properly. "My mom is so excited to meet you," she said. "She lit up when I told her you were Army," she said. "Logistics officers are the backbone of everything. Nobody understands that until they've been in the field." I had held the phone very still for a moment. "Your mom sounds amazing," I said. "She really is," Renee said. "Fair warning, she'll probably want to talk shop all night." She laughed. I laughed. I didn't tell Renee that the rest of my family would likely spend the evening explaining that my shop wasn't worth talking about. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in downtown Columbus called Hartwell's, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a sommelier and a prix-fixe menu that my parents had clearly stressed about affording, though they would never admit it. My mother wore her good pearls. My father had gotten a haircut. David arrived 12 minutes late in the silver watch and shook hands with everyone like he was running for something. I arrived in my civilian clothes, dark slacks, a navy blouse, because I was off duty and because I have never been someone who wears the uniform to make a point. I sat near the middle of the table, between my aunt on one side and an empty chair on the other that was later filled by Renee's cousin from Richmond. Colonel Weston sat at the far end, directly across from my mother. The first hour was pleasant enough. Wine was poured, bread came in a basket. Gerald told a story about a fishing trip that made everyone laugh. My mother talked about David's promotion and the new condo he was thinking of buying in the short north. David accepted the attention with the ease of someone who had been accepting it his whole life. Then Renee's aunt, a cheerful woman named Beverly who had driven up from Tennessee, leaned across the table toward me and asked what I did for work. I said I was an Army officer, logistics branch. Beverly's face opened up. "Oh, how wonderful! My nephew was Army. He served in the early 2000s. You must have seen so much." And my mother, from 4 seats away, somehow heard this and turned and said, with the lightness of someone saying something perfectly normal, "Oh, she's never really been anywhere. She manages supplies. It's administrative, really." Beverly looked uncertain, the way people do when they sense something is wrong but can't quite name it. "It's important work, though," Beverly offered, kindly. "Of course," my mother said, and then she turned back to her conversation. I picked up my water glass. I set it down. I breathed. David caught my eye from across the table and gave me the small, familiar shrug that meant, "Don't make this a thing." I had been receiving that shrug my entire life. "David works in corporate strategy now," my mother continued, "to no one in particular, and everyone at once. He manages a team of 40 people. He just closed a deal that was in the news. Did you see it, Patricia?" Colonel Weston, who had been quietly listening, looked up. "I'm sorry. I didn't catch that." "David's deal. It was in the Columbus Business Journal. I'll have to look for it," the colonel said pleasantly. Then she looked at me. "Clara, which post were you stationed at most recently, if you don't mind my asking?" Before I could answer, my brother set down his knife and said, with the comfortable authority of someone who has never been contradicted, "2 presents. She's been at Fort Campbell mostly, right, Clara? Supply depot stuff. She's never been deployed. No combat experience." He said it the way you'd say she's never been to Europe, like it was a mild gap in an otherwise acceptable resume. The table went quiet in the specific way that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Renee, to her credit, looked at her plate. Gerald reached for his wine. Beverly suddenly found her bread very interesting. Colonel Weston put down her fork. She did not slam it. She placed it with the precise deliberateness of someone who has trained herself never to waste a gesture. She looked at my brother for one long moment, and then she looked at me. "First Lieutenant Mendez," she said, and the use of my rank in that room, in that context, from her, did something to the air. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to feel completely free not to answer." The table had gone completely still. "Were you assigned to Operation Quiet Meridian between March and September of last year?" I looked at her. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite pride, not quite grief, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. "I can't confirm the name of any specific operation, ma'am," I said. "Of course," she said, "but I'll tell you what I can confirm." She looked around the table slowly at my mother, at my father, at my brother with his silver watch. "I sat on the logistics review board for a joint coalition mission last year, a mission that required a supply chain to be built from nothing, in a location I am also not at liberty to name, in a window of approximately 72 hours, under conditions that I have only seen matched twice in my 26 years of service." She paused. The officer who built that chain was 26 years old. She did not sleep for 41 hours. She improvised 3 separate contingency routes after the primary was compromised. And because of what she built, 22 personnel came home who would not have come home otherwise. Nobody spoke. Beverly had stopped pretending to look at her bread. "The name on that report," Colonel Weston said, "was Mendez." My mother's face had gone the color of the white tablecloth. She started. "I don't say this to embarrass anyone," the colonel said, and her voice was completely even, completely measured, the voice of a woman who has delivered hard truths in difficult places her whole life. "I say it because your daughter is sitting at this table, and she has not said a single word in her own defense tonight, and I have spent 26 years watching people like her stay quiet while people who have never done a fraction of what they've done talk over them." She looked at David. "Logistics is not administrative. Logistics is the reason operations succeed or fail. It is the reason people live or die. If you don't know that, I'd encourage you to learn it." David opened his mouth. He closed it again. My father was looking at his hands. My mother said, very quietly, "We didn't know." "I know you didn't," the colonel said. And then, for the first time since she'd placed down her fork, she smiled just slightly. "Just enough." She looked at me. "She didn't tell you because she couldn't, and probably also because she spent a long time not expecting you to see her. But I see her, and the United States Army sees her, and that is what I wanted you to know." I did not cry at the table. I had not cried in front of my family since I was 11 years old, and I was not going to start now. But when dinner ended, and the table broke into smaller conversations, and the sommelier came back with dessert menus, I excused myself and walked to the hallway outside the restrooms, and I leaned against the cool wall, and I let myself shake for about 30 seconds. Just 30 seconds. Because that's all I allowed. Then Renee found me. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood beside me the way people do when they understand that words aren't the thing that's needed. Then she said, "I'm sorry my mother ambushed you." I laughed. It came out a little broken and a little real. "Please don't apologize to me for your mother. She told me afterward that she recognized your name from the report. She said she's been waiting to meet you since she saw it." Renee paused. She said, "You should be a major by now, and if you aren't, it's the Army's problem." I laughed again, and this time it was more like the real thing. "She's not wrong," I said. Renee put her hand on my arm. "For what it's worth, I've always known David gets too much, and you don't get enough. I see it. I've seen it since the first time I met your family. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I looked at her, this woman who was about to become my sister-in-law, who had called me 2 weeks ago with genuine warmth in her voice, who had a mother who sat on review boards and built bridges, and had said my name across a table full of people who had spent years pretending not to know it. "You don't have to apologize," I said, "but thank you." We went back to the table. David was quiet for the rest of the night, not sulking exactly, but something more like recalibrating. My father caught my eye once and held it, and I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen before or hadn't let myself look for. My mother did not look at me directly again, but when dessert came, she pushed the creme brulee toward me without saying anything, because it was the one I always ordered as a kid, and she remembered. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't repair. It was one small gesture, one thin thread in a fabric that had been tangled for a very long time, and I didn't know yet if it was enough to pull on. But I knew this. I had sat at that table for 27 years, waiting for someone to say, "We see you." And when it finally happened, it hadn't come from my mother, or my father, or my brother with his silver watch. It had come from a retired colonel with 26 years of service and a handshake like she meant it. Before I left that night, I stopped by my grandmother's house. Abuela Rosa lived 12 minutes from the restaurant, in the same house she'd lived in for 40 years, and she was still awake at 10:30 because she always was, because she said sleep was for people who had nothing left to think about. She opened the door and looked at me and said, "Mija, what happened?" I said, "Someone saw me tonight, Abuela." She pulled me inside and made me sit at the kitchen table and brought out the good hot chocolate she kept for emergencies, and I told her everything. And when I was finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think you have been seen your whole life. You just kept looking in the wrong room." I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about the 41 hours I had not slept, and the 3 contingency routes, and the 22 people who came home. I thought about my grandfather, Papa Hector, and the VA hospital on Saturdays, and the handshake that felt like she already knew something the rest of the table didn't. I thought about what it means to do real work in quiet places and never ask to be recognized for it, and what it feels like when someone recognizes you anyway. My brother's wedding was 2 days later. It was beautiful, Renee cried during the vows in the best way, and Gerald danced with her to something from the 70s, and the colonel found me near the bar during cocktail hour and handed me her card without ceremony and said, "If you ever want to talk about what comes next, call me." I put the card in my pocket. David and I didn't have a grand reconciliation at the reception. We didn't hug it out. We didn't sit in the corner and finally say all the things we'd never said. He found me near the end of the night and said, "I didn't know, Clara, about the mission, about any of it." "I know you didn't," I said. I should have asked. I looked at him, my older brother, the chosen one, the one with the watch and the balloon arch and 20 years of being the son, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and was maybe the very beginning of something else. "Yeah," I said, "you should have." It wasn't enough, and it wasn't nothing, and it was true. I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was October and the air had that clean, cold edge that October air gets in Ohio. I thought about the colonel's card in my pocket. I thought about Abuela Rosa's kitchen and the hot chocolate, and you have been seen your whole life, you just kept looking in the wrong room. I thought about the 22 people who came home. Some things don't need to be said at a dinner table to be real. Some work is done in the dark and in the quiet and in the places that don't have names on public maps, and the people who do it don't need the applause to know the value of what they built. But it doesn't hurt, sometimes, to have a colonel look across a table and say your name like it means what it always meant. It doesn't hurt at all.